The evening light poured softly through the tall glass windows of the mansion, spreading golden reflections across the marble floor. The sound of laughter echoed faintly from the ballroom as staff hurried around, setting tables, polishing glasses, and arranging flowers. Everything had to be perfect. The billionaire woman who owned the house was known for her attention to detail and her pride. Nothing ever escaped her sharp eyes. She stood in the middle of the grand hall, giving instructions in a calm but commanding tone. Her designer dress shimmered under the chandelier, and her diamond bracelet sparkled each time she raised her hand to point at something that needed correction. To her, this charity event wasn't just about helping others. It was a chance to show her influence, her wealth, her perfection. Every guest would be from the city's elite, and every moment had to impress. In the corner, almost unseen, a maid quietly wiped the edges of a polished table. Her hands moved quickly and carefully, making sure not a speck of dust remained. Her young son stood near her, holding a small basket of napkins. He looked around with wide eyes, at the shining piano in the center of the room, the tall vases of fresh roses, and the glittering chandeliers above. Everything looked magical to him, almost unreal. He had never seen so much beauty in one place. The maid noticed her son staring and whispered softly, "Keep your eyes down, dear. We're just here to work." But the boy couldn't help it. His eyes kept returning to the grand piano, a large white instrument with smooth curved edges and golden pedals. It stood proudly at the far end of the hall like a throne made of sound. He had only seen one like it once before, in a music shop window downtown, but this one seemed even more beautiful. As the evening went on, the mansion filled with guests. Expensive cars pulled up one after another, and people dressed in elegant suits and glittering gowns entered, holding glasses of champagne. Laughter filled the air, the kind of laughter that sounded rehearsed, polite, and slightly forced. The maid and other staff moved quietly between the tables, serving drinks, refilling trays, and clearing empty plates. Her son stayed close, helping her carry things when he could, but his attention always drifted toward the piano. The billionaire noticed him at one point. Her eyes followed his gaze toward the instrument, and she smirked faintly. To her, it was amusing. A boy from a maid's world staring so longingly at something that belonged to hers. She whispered something to one of her guests, and they both smiled knowingly. "He probably thinks it's a toy," the woman joked softly. The music in the background faded as the hired pianist finished his set for the evening and stepped aside to rest. The billionaire turned toward the guests and said with pride, "This piano was custom-made in Italy. It cost more than most houses in this city." Her voice carried across the hall, confident and commanding. She enjoyed the admiring looks from her guests. Then her eyes landed again on the boy. He was still standing near the corner, half hidden behind his mother, staring at the piano like it held a secret he couldn't quite reach. Something in her expression changed, amusement mixed with a touch of arrogance. "You there?" she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the room. Everyone turned to see who she was addressing. The maid froze when she realized it was her son. Her heart raced. The boy looked up, startled. "Come here," the billionaire said, her smile sharp and confident. "You seem very interested in my piano." The boy hesitated, glancing at his mother. She shook her head slightly, whispering, "Don't, please." But the billionaire's tone left no room for refusal. "It's all right," she said. "I'm just curious." Slowly, the boy stepped forward, his small hands clutching the edge of his shirt. His footsteps echoed faintly on the marble floor. The guests watched with amusement, expecting a silly scene to unfold. When he stopped near the piano, the billionaire looked down at him and asked, "Do you even know what that instrument costs?" The boy said nothing. He simply looked at the piano, his eyes full of quiet wonder. The guests laughed lightly, sensing the tone of the moment. The billionaire tilted her head, enjoying the attention. "Why don't you play something for us?" she said suddenly. "Let's see what you can do." The room filled with soft murmurs. The maid gasped quietly and rushed forward, bowing slightly. "Ma'am, please, he's just a child," she said nervously. But the billionaire waved her off. "It's just for fun," she replied with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Let's see if he can play this beautiful piano he's been admiring all evening." The guests chuckled again, waiting. Some whispered to each other, amused by the idea. The boy looked up at his mother, unsure what to do. Her face was pale, her eyes full of pleading. "It's all right," he whispered softly, though his voice trembled. "I'll just try." She wanted to stop him, but something in his tone made her step back. The boy walked closer to the piano. The surface gleamed under the warm lights. He reached out slowly and ran his fingers across the smooth white keys, almost afraid to touch them. He could see his reflection in the polished lid, a small boy in worn clothes standing in front of something that belonged to another world. The guests whispered again, some smiling, some shaking their heads. "This should be entertaining," one man said quietly. The billionaire folded her arms, curious to see what would happen next. To her, it was a harmless little joke. She didn't expect anything more. The boy sat down on the piano bench. His feet didn't quite reach the pedals, and his hands trembled slightly as he placed them on the keys. He took a deep breath. The room fell quiet, waiting for the first sound. But he didn't play yet. He closed his eyes for a moment, remembering. He remembered the small community center near their apartment where an old broken piano sat in the corner. The keys were yellowed and cracked, and half of them didn't make a sound. But he used to sneak in after school, pressing the ones that still worked, trying to copy the tunes he heard from the street performers or from the television his neighbors watched. He never had lessons, never had anyone to teach him, but somehow music had always made sense to him, like it was another language he already knew. Now, sitting in front of the most beautiful piano he had ever seen, he felt that same feeling rise inside him, a mix of fear and love, excitement and peace. He pressed one key softly. A clear, gentle note filled the room, bright and smooth. The sound was perfect. The guests fell silent for a moment, surprised that he hadn't simply banged on it like a child might. The boy pressed another key, then another, testing the sound. And though his hands trembled, something inside him started to wake. The maid stood near the wall, her hands clasped tightly together, her eyes full of worry. She wanted to run to him, to pull him away before anyone could laugh. But something in his calm, focused face stopped her. He wasn't nervous anymore. He looked peaceful. The billionaire's smile faded slightly. She had expected a quick, clumsy attempt, maybe a few wrong notes and a burst of laughter from her guests. But the way the boy touched the piano wasn't random. It was careful, gentle, almost respectful. He seemed to understand the instrument in a way that felt impossible. The boy's small fingers moved again. A few quiet notes drifted through the hall. It wasn't a song, not yet, but the sound was pure and emotional. It had something honest about it, something no one could quite explain. The laughter died down completely. The guests leaned forward, curious now. The boy didn't notice them anymore. He just listened to the sound of the piano, feeling it with every part of his heart. For a few seconds, the mansion, usually filled with the noise of chatter, music and clinking glasses, and was utterly silent. The only thing that could be heard was the soft, hesitant melody from the piano, like a whisper turning into a breath. Then the boy stopped. His hands rested gently on the keys. He looked up at the billionaire for the first time. She stared back, unsure what to say. Her smirk was gone. Her eyes, once amused, now looked thoughtful, maybe even confused. The boy stood up quietly and stepped back. The room remained silent for a few moments longer. The maid rushed forward, gently touching her son's shoulder. "It's all right," she whispered shakily. "You did good." She wanted to take him away before anyone spoke again. The billionaire said nothing. The guests watched, waiting for her reaction, but she just stood there looking at the piano, lost in thought. Something about that small moment had unsettled her. The confidence in his silence, the beauty in those few uncertain notes. As the boy and his mother turned to leave the hall, the air felt different. The laughter hadn't returned. The music had stopped. For the first time that evening, something real had touched that perfect, glittering world, and no one quite knew how to respond. The boy stood quietly beside his mother as she guided him back toward the corner of the hall. His small hand still tingled from touching the piano keys. He didn't understand what had just happened. Everything had gone silent after he played those few notes. No one had laughed, but no one had clapped either. He had just felt the music calling from inside him, and his fingers had moved without thought. Now, as the silence hung in his mind, he couldn't tell if he had done something wrong. His mother's grip on his shoulder was gentle, but tense. She whispered in a low voice, "You shouldn't have done that." But her tone wasn't angry. It was full of worry. She knew how these moments could turn cruel in a world that didn't belong to them. Her eyes stayed down as they moved past the guests. She wanted to blend back into the background, to disappear before anyone remembered them. Behind them, the billionaire watched, her face unreadable. The guests began to talk again, their whispers floating through the air like the hum of bees. Some laughed lightly, pretending the moment hadn't affected them. Others looked thoughtful, as if they'd seen something unusual but didn't know what to make of it. The billionaire said nothing. She turned away and began talking to one of her guests about the next performance. But a part of her mind kept returning to that small boy and the sound of his hesitant, beautiful notes. In the corner of the room, the boy looked up at his mother. "Did I embarrass you?" he asked quietly. She turned to him, eyes softening. "No," she said, shaking her head. "You didn't, but you must understand this isn't our place. These people don't see us the way they see each other." Her words were gentle but heavy. He looked down, not fully understanding why the simple act of touching a piano could make people so uncomfortable. The evening went on. The music returned. Laughter filled the air again, and the moment seemed forgotten. But not for him. Every time he carried an empty tray past the piano, his eyes lingered. He wanted to sit again, to play properly this time, to show them that he could make the piano speak the way he heard it in his head. But he stayed silent, watching from a distance. He could feel his mother's anxious eyes on him every time he looked that way. Later, when most guests had moved to the dining area, the billionaire found herself near the piano again. She ran her fingers across the keys absent-mindedly, her thoughts elsewhere. One of her friends teased her lightly. "You almost looked moved earlier," the woman said with a laugh. "By a maid's son, no less." The billionaire gave a faint smile. "He just surprised me, that's all. I didn't expect him to touch the piano like that." "It wasn't childish. It was different." Her friend shrugged. "Maybe he got lucky," she said. "Children sometimes imitate things without knowing what they're doing." The billionaire nodded slowly, though her mind didn't agree. Something about the boy's eyes, the calmness when he sat, had stayed with her. The boy and his mother worked quietly as the night stretched on. He watched how easily the guests laughed, how comfortable they were in their luxury. The chandelier lights danced above them like small stars. He thought about how strange it was that people could have so much and still seem so restless. His mother noticed him lost in thought and whispered, "Stay close, we'll be done soon." He nodded, though his eyes once again wandered toward the piano. When the final guests began to leave, the hall grew quieter. The laughter faded, replaced by the soft sounds of staff cleaning up. The boy helped his mother fold napkins and gather glasses. He could still hear the melody from earlier echoing in his head. He wanted to play it again, this time fully, not just a few notes. But he knew it wasn't possible. The piano belonged to a world that wasn't his. Still, something in him refused to let the dream go. He whispered softly, "Mama, if I could play again, do you think they would listen?" She looked at him with tired eyes and said, "You don't need their attention. You just need to play for yourself." Her voice was quiet, almost sad. "When you play, I see your father in you." He loved music too. But dreams are heavy when you have to carry them alone. The boy nodded, though he didn't fully understand her words. He just knew that music made him feel free, even if only for a few minutes. He wanted that feeling again. A few days passed after the event. The mansion returned to its quiet rhythm. The maid resumed her daily work, dusting, polishing, cleaning. Her son often came with her after school, helping wherever he could. The billionaire rarely spoke to them directly. She was always busy, meetings, calls, charity events. But sometimes from her office upstairs, she could hear faint humming coming from the servants' quarters. A soft melody repeated again and again. One afternoon, she followed the sound out of curiosity. She found the boy sitting outside near the garden wall, drawing something on a piece of cardboard. He had sketched a rough outline of piano keys and was tapping them lightly with his fingers, humming to himself. The billionaire stopped a few steps away, watching silently. He didn't notice her at first. His eyes were focused, his lips moving quietly with the tune. It wasn't random tapping. There was rhythm, emotion, even precision in the way he moved. She frowned slightly, puzzled. "What are you doing?" she asked finally. The boy jumped, startled. He quickly stood up, hiding the cardboard behind him. "Nothing, ma'am," he said nervously. "Just playing." She stepped closer and looked at the board. "Those are piano keys," she said softly. He nodded. "I don't have a piano," he explained shyly. So I made one. His words were simple, but they struck her strangely. There was no complaint in his tone, and only honesty. Do you really love music that much? She asked, curious. He nodded again, his eyes bright. It makes me feel like the world listens, he said, even if no one hears. For a long moment, the billionaire said nothing. She looked at the cardboard piano and then at the boy. You shouldn't waste time on things that can't change your life, she said finally, her voice soft but firm. Music is beautiful, but dreams don't always feed you. The boy smiled faintly. But sometimes they keep you alive, he whispered. The billionaire turned and walked away without replying. But the boy's words lingered in her mind. That night, while sitting in her study, she remembered the sound of the few notes he had played days ago. There had been something raw in them, something that couldn't be taught. The next morning, the maid came to clean the office. The billionaire glanced at her and asked casually, Does your son always play music? The maid paused, unsure of what to say. He just loves it, she said softly. He plays on anything he can find. He listens to songs on the radio and tries to copy them. Sometimes he even hums in his sleep. The billionaire said nothing more, but she nodded as if understanding something for the first time. That afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the mansion, the boy lingered again near the piano in the main hall. The billionaire was upstairs and the room was empty. He looked around carefully, then stepped closer. His reflection appeared once again in the glossy surface. He touched a key lightly, just one. The sound echoed softly. He pressed another. The tone filled the quiet air like a secret whispered between friends. He closed his eyes and began to play quietly, almost afraid of being heard. The melody was shaky at first, then steadier. He didn't know the names of the notes or the theory behind them. He just followed what his heart told him. Each sound felt like a piece of a story he couldn't tell in words. His fingers moved faster. His breathing deepened, and suddenly he wasn't in the mansion anymore. He was somewhere else, free, happy, floating in his own little world of music. He didn't notice the footsteps behind him until the sound stopped. The billionaire stood at the doorway watching. She didn't speak, afraid to break the spell of what she was hearing. The boy continued to play, lost in the music. When he finally looked up and saw her, his hands froze on the keys. I'm sorry, he said quickly, standing up. I didn't mean to. She raised her hand slightly. Don't stop, she said quietly. Her voice was calm, not angry. Play. The boy hesitated, unsure if it was a trick, but something in her eyes told him it wasn't. He sat back down, took a deep breath, and began again. The melody filled the hall once more, soft but full of feeling. The billionaire listened without a word. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't thinking about business or status or wealth. She was simply listening, really listening. And in that moment, she understood something she had never considered before. Genius didn't always wear a suit or come from privilege. Sometimes it came from silence, from struggle, from a heart that refused to stop dreaming. When he finished, the room stayed still. The billionaire looked at the boy for a long moment, then said quietly, Who taught you? He shook his head. No one, he said simply. I just listened. She didn't respond. She turned and walked out of the room, but this time her steps were slower, her thoughts heavier. Behind her, the boy touched one last key, letting the note fade gently into the air, like a secret between them that neither quite understood yet. The morning after the boy played in the empty hall, the mansion seemed quieter than usual. The billionaire walked through the corridors with her usual calm grace, but her thoughts were far away. The sound of that melody still echoed faintly in her mind. It had been simple, untrained, but filled with something she couldn't name. She had heard hundreds of professional musicians, but this was different. It had felt alive. She tried to shake it off as coincidence, a boy playing random keys. Nothing more. But even as she sat in her office signing papers, she found herself tapping her fingers on the table, repeating the rhythm he'd played the night before. It was haunting her in a quiet way she didn't understand. Downstairs, the maid moved through her morning tasks, her son walking beside her, carrying a small bucket of cleaning cloths. He was quiet too, though his eyes glowed with something new, something almost like hope. He still couldn't believe she had listened to him. The billionaire. The woman everyone in the mansion spoke about in hushed tones. The one people looked at with respect and fear. She had told him to play, and she hadn't stopped him. He kept replaying that moment in his head, the sound of her voice, the stillness of the room, the way she'd listened. Not with pity, not with judgment, just silence. He didn't know if it was a good silence or a bad one, but to him, it felt like the world had stood still, even for a second that afternoon. As the sun filtered through the tall windows, he passed by the music room again. The piano sat there gleaming in the light, its surface reflecting the soft golden glow. The room was empty. His mother had gone to polish the silverware in the dining room. For a long moment he stood at the doorway, torn between duty and desire. He knew he shouldn't. He remembered his mother's worried eyes, but the piano called to him quietly, the same way waves call to the shore. He stepped closer, one cautious step at a time. The scent of polish and fresh roses filled the room. He could hear faint footsteps upstairs, but nothing else. It was safe for now. He sat on the bench again, his small frame almost swallowed by its size. His fingers hovered over the keys, trembling slightly. He pressed one note soft, like a whisper. The sound spread through the air, smooth and full. Then another note, and another. Soon a gentle rhythm began to form, and without meaning to, he started playing a tune he had made up months ago. It was a melody he used to hum at night, one he had imagined when he couldn't sleep. Back then he had only a cardboard piano. Now he had the real thing beneath his hands. The feeling was different, stronger, fuller, more alive. His eyes closed as he played, his body swaying gently with the rhythm. Upstairs, the billionaire was finishing a phone call when she heard something faint through the air vents. She paused mid-sentence. It was that sound again, the same soft, emotional tune that had followed her all night. But now it was fuller, clearer. Her assistant on the other end of the line called her name twice before she realized she had stopped talking. "I'll call you back," she said quickly and hung up. She stood up, following the sound like someone drawn by an invisible thread. Down the stairs, through the hall, until she reached the open door of the music room. The boy didn't notice her standing there. He was lost in the song. His small shoulders rose and fell with each breath. His fingers moved quickly but gently, never striking too hard, never hesitating. It wasn't perfect. A few notes stumbled, some chords didn't quite fit, but the heart inside the music was undeniable. It was honest. It was raw. The billionaire leaned against the doorway, arms folded, her expression unreadable. She wasn't thinking about his background now, or his mother's uniform, or the rules of class that had always felt so certain. She was simply listening. The music made her remember something distant. She had once been a little girl sitting at a piano too, guided by a teacher who told her to play with precision, not emotion. She had learned the rules, the scales, the perfect form, but she had never played like this boy was playing now. When the boy finally finished, he took a deep breath, his hands falling still on the keys. For a long moment he just sat there, eyes closed, letting the sound fade. Then he heard the soft clap of hands. He turned around in shock. The billionaire was standing there, her face calm but her eyes softer than he had ever seen them. "You have a gift," she said quietly. The boy's mouth opened, but no words came out. "You shouldn't hide it," she added, stepping closer. He looked down, embarrassed. "I didn't mean to play," he said quickly. I couldn't help it." She smiled faintly. "I know." There was something kind in her tone this time. Not teasing, not mocking. Just truth. He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. "Play again," she said suddenly. "But this time play what's in your heart. Don't think. Just play." He hesitated. "Now?" he asked. She nodded. "Now!" His heart began to race. He turned back to the piano, his hands trembling again. He looked up once as if to make sure she really meant it. She gave a small nod, her expression serious. So he began. The first notes came slowly, soft as falling rain. Then the melody began to build, flowing through the air like a story without words. He played of quiet nights when his mother hummed him to sleep, of mornings when the world seemed too heavy but music made it lighter. Every emotion he had ever buried came out through his fingertips. Hope, fear, sadness, joy. The billionaire stood completely still. The sunlight through the windows hit the piano lid and cast long reflections on the floor, flickering like water. The boy's music filled the hall, bouncing off the marble walls, climbing to the ceiling. The room that once belonged to silence now belonged to him. A few of the household staff stopped nearby, drawn by the sound. They stood in the doorway, whispering softly, their eyes wide. They had never heard anything like it. Even the maid arriving from the dining room froze when she saw her son at the piano again. Her heart raced in fear at first, but then she saw the billionaire standing there, not angry, not mocking, just listening. The boy played on, unaware of the small crowd forming at the door. His fingers flew across the keys now, sure and confident, as though he had practiced all his life. When he finally struck the last note, it hung in the air like a heartbeat. Then came silence. Pure, deep silence. He turned around slowly. His mother stood frozen, tears glistening in her eyes. The other servants were quiet, unsure whether to clap or speak. The billionaire looked at the boy for a long moment, her face unreadable. Then softly she said, "That was beautiful." The boy blinked, unsure if he had heard her correctly. "Really?" he whispered. She nodded once. "Yes, beautiful." His mother took a small step forward, her voice trembling. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry."
He didn't mean. The billionaire lifted her hand.
"Don't apologize," she said quietly. "He didn't do anything wrong." The maid stopped, her eyes wide in disbelief. No one had ever spoken to her like that before. Not in this house. She looked at her son, pride and fear mixing in her heart. The billionaire turned back to the boy. "Where did you learn to play like that?" she asked softly. He hesitated, glancing at his mother. "I just listened," he said finally. "I listen to people who play in the park, on the radio, and sometimes I imagine the rest myself." There was silence again. The billionaire looked at him, then at the piano, then back. Something inside her shifted quietly, something she didn't want to name yet. "You can go now," she said finally, though her voice had softened. "But come back tomorrow. I want to hear you again." The boy blinked. "Tomorrow?" "Yes," she said. "After your mother's work is done." His mother's mouth opened in surprise, but she didn't speak. The boy nodded quickly, his face lighting up with excitement he could barely hide. "Thank you," he whispered. That night he could hardly sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the piano, heard the notes echoing in the grand hall. His mother sat beside him, brushing his hair gently. "Be careful," she whispered. "Don't expect too much." He looked up at her and smiled softly. "I just want to play again," he said. "That's all." She sighed but didn't argue. She had seen something change in him that day, something she hadn't seen in years. A spark. The next morning, the boy woke before sunrise. He helped his mother with her chores faster than ever, his mind already racing ahead to the piano room. The mansion woke slowly around them, sunlight spreading through the glass windows like gold. When the billionaire came downstairs, she saw him waiting quietly by the piano bench, his small hands folded neatly. For the first time, she smiled at him, not the practice smile she used for guests, but a real one. "Ready?" she asked. He nodded eagerly. She sat down in a chair nearby and he placed his fingers on the keys. As the first notes filled the room, something invisible but powerful connected them. The woman who had everything and the boy who had nothing, bound by the one thing neither could explain. And for a while, the walls of wealth and status disappeared. All that remained was music. For a long moment there was nothing but silence. The sound of the final note seemed to hang in the air like a soft echo that refused to fade. The boy's hands rested gently on the keys, his fingers trembling slightly, his chest rising and falling as if he had just run a long distance. He didn't look at anyone. His eyes stayed low, staring at the piano that had just revealed the world inside him. Around him, the large room was frozen in time. The chandelier lights shimmered quietly, but even their glow seemed softer now. No one moved. The guests who had come dressed in jewels and perfume stood completely still. A woman in a red gown had her hand pressed against her chest, her mouth open but no words coming out. The butler near the doorway blinked several times, unsure if what he'd just witnessed was real. The billionaire, who had started all of this with a smirk, sat on the velvet chair near the piano, her expression unreadable. Her hand was still holding her glass of champagne, but it was tilted just enough that the bubbles had gone still. The proud, polished look in her eyes had faded into something else, something quieter, heavier. The maid stood near the wall, frozen. She had wanted to pull her son away before he played, afraid he would embarrass himself. Now her hands covered her mouth, tears slowly filling her eyes. She had never seen him play like this. She had heard him at home playing the small cracked keyboard someone had once given them, but this was different. He had never sounded like this before. It was as if the music had come alive inside him, pouring out in ways words could never say. The boy finally lifted his hands from the keys. The silence in the room grew even deeper, the kind that makes hearts beat louder. Then, almost shyly, he stood up and stepped back from the piano. He didn't know whether to bow, smile, or run away. His heart pounded hard in his chest. He glanced toward his mother. Her face was wet with tears, but she was smiling. That smile gave him strength. The billionaire cleared her throat softly. Where did you learn that?" she asked in a voice that had lost all of its sharpness. The boy looked at her and spoke in a small voice. "From this piano," he said. "The one my mother cleans every night." The words struck like quiet thunder. The maid lowered her head, embarrassed, but the billionaire didn't mock. She didn't even blink. For a second, she didn't know what to say. The boy wasn't lying. He had been listening, watching, learning all this time while his mother dusted the piano after dinners, after parties, after long nights when no one noticed them. One of the guests finally whispered, He's amazing." Another added, "That was not a child's play. That was pure feeling." The billionaire set her glass down slowly. She stood and walked closer to the piano, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor. "What's your name?" she asked. The boy hesitated, unsure if he should speak. His mother answered quietly from across the room. The billionaire repeated his name under her breath as if trying to memorize it. "You played that by ear?" she asked again. He nodded. "I don't know how to read notes, I just remember sounds." Her eyes softened. She looked at the piano again, then at him. "And you've never had a teacher?" "No," he said. "We can't afford lessons." The room shifted again, this time not in mockery but in shame. The guests who had laughed earlier lowered their heads. The billionaire glanced at them, her lips pressing into a thin line. She had invited these people for prestige and power, yet at that moment she felt strangely small among them. The maid stepped forward, wiping her face quickly with the corner of her apron. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," she said nervously. "He didn't mean to." The billionaire raised a hand gently to stop her. "Don't apologize," she said. "He did nothing wrong." The boy stood silently beside the piano, his shoulders tense, not knowing what to do next. The billionaire turned to the guests. "I think the evening has already given us something more valuable than any concert could," she said softly. No one argued. The boy's mother walked up to him and took his hand, whispering, "Oh, you were wonderful." Her voice broke halfway through the words. He smiled shyly and squeezed her hand. He didn't care about what the guests thought anymore. He had played because the piano called to him, and now that it was done, he felt light, as if the music had freed something inside him. When they turned to leave, the billionaire called out. "Wait," they stopped. The billionaire looked around at her guests and said quietly, "I think everyone should go home now." Her tone left no room for questions. The guests nodded, whispering to one another, and began to leave one by one. Some stopped near the boy and his mother, murmuring compliments before hurrying out, embarrassed that they had laughed earlier. Within minutes, the grand hall was nearly empty. Only the chandelier still glittered above them, and the faint hum of night air filled the silence. The billionaire approached slowly, her usual air of superiority replaced with something more thoughtful. "You played beautifully," she said softly. The boy looked down. "Thank you. Do you know what that piece was?" she asked. He shook his head. "It wasn't a piece, I just played what I felt." Her lips parted slightly in surprise. "You composed it?" He shrugged. "I think so. It's just what comes out when I sit there." The billionaire turned to the piano again. "You played better than half the professionals I've heard in this room," she said, her voice quiet but sincere. "And you did it with no training." The maid bowed slightly. "Ma'am, he just listens to everything. He sits outside the music school sometimes and watches through the windows. He's always listening." The billionaire nodded slowly, her eyes softening. "That's real talent," she said. "Not taught, not bought, just born." The boy didn't fully understand what she meant, but the warmth in her tone felt kind. For the first time, the billionaire noticed how tired the maid looked, how her hands were rough from years of cleaning. Yet tonight she looked taller somehow, like pride had lifted her posture. The boy looked up at her with the same quiet strength, the same warmth. The billionaire realized she had been blind to their humanity all along. The boy's mother whispered, "Thank you for letting him play." The billionaire paused before answering. "No," she said slowly. "Thank you for reminding me what music is supposed to feel like." That night, long after the boy and his mother had gone, the billionaire sat alone in the grand hall. The piano still stood where it always had, polished and silent. She ran her fingers across the keys but didn't press them. She wasn't sure she could ever make it sing the way that boy had. She thought about all the years she had owned that piano, using it as a decoration, something expensive to show her success. But to that boy it had been a world of dreams. He had found beauty where she had only seen furniture. The sound of his music still lingered in her mind. Every note had carried something raw, something real. Pain, hope, and joy all mixed together. She realized then that music was not about skill or fame or money. It was about honesty. And that boy had played with more honesty than she had ever known. Before she went to bed, she told the head butler, "Tomorrow morning, bring the maid and her son to see me. I want to talk to them again." The butler nodded, though his face showed quiet surprise. As the billionaire climbed the stairs to her room, she stopped halfway and looked back at the piano one last time. The reflection of the chandelier danced across its black surface, and for a moment she could almost see the boy sitting there again, his fingers flying across the keys, his face calm and focused, as if the whole world had disappeared. She whispered softly to herself, "Genius doesn't always come from where we expect." In another part of the city, the maid and her son walked home hand in hand through the quiet streets. The night air was cool, and the stars shimmered faintly above them. They didn't speak for a while. The boy was still thinking about the sound of the grand piano beneath his fingers. Finally, his mother spoke. "You made everyone listen tonight," she said gently. "Even people who never listened to anyone." The boy smiled faintly. "I just played what I felt inside," she nodded. "That's what makes it special." He looked up at her. "Do you think I'll ever get to play like that again?" His mother squeezed his hand. "If it's meant to be, it will happen again," she said softly. Neither of them knew that the woman in the mansion had already decided their lives were about to change forever. And as they disappeared into the night, the faint echo of the boy's melody still seemed to drift behind them, gentle, haunting, unforgettable. The next morning began quietly. The maid woke up before dawn as she always did. She boiled water on the small stove and made tea, glancing toward her son who was still asleep on the thin mattress beside the window. He looked peaceful, his hand resting on his chest, fingers twitching slightly as if still playing the piano in his dreams. She smiled faintly and let him rest. The house they lived in was small and old. The walls carried the smell of soap and cooking oil, but it was home. As she sipped her tea, her mind went back to the night before. The music, the silence that followed, the look on everyone's faces, it all felt unreal. She had seen her son play before, but never like that. It was as if he had become someone else in that moment, someone fearless, someone who spoke through sound instead of words. She knew people like the billionaire rarely remembered moments like that once the party ended. Still, she was proud. That was enough. When the morning sun began to rise, she gently shook her son awake. "Time to get ready," she whispered. He rubbed his eyes. "For work?" "Yes," she said softly. "You can rest after. I have to finish some things at the mansion today." He sat up, stretching his arms. "Do you think she was angry that I played?" His mother smiled sadly. "I don't think so. But even if she was, what's done is done. You made people listen. That's something most grown-ups can't do." He nodded slowly, though part of him still wondered if he had done something wrong. By the time they reached the mansion, the house was unusually quiet. The air smelled of fresh flowers and polish. The maid went straight to her duties, scrubbing and dusting in silence, but her heart was restless. Something felt different today. The head butler approached her after an hour and said, "The madam wants to see you." "Both of you," she froze. "Now?" "Yes," he said, nodding. "In the music room." Her hands trembled slightly. She looked over at her son, who was cleaning a vase near the entrance, and motioned for him to come. Together, they walked through the long corridors that led to the grand hall. The echo of their footsteps mixed with the soft ticking of a clock somewhere above. When they entered the room, the billionaire was standing near the piano. She wasn't dressed like last night. Her hair was tied back, her clothes simple, and her expression thoughtful. She looked at them as they walked in. "Come in," she said quietly. The maid bowed slightly. "You wanted to see us, ma'am?" "Yes." The billionaire turned her eyes toward the boy. "I couldn't sleep last night. That music kept playing in my head. The boy lowered his gaze, unsure what to say. She continued. I asked my staff about you. I learned that you've never taken a single lesson, never had a teacher, never owned a proper instrument. The maid nodded nervously. That's true, ma'am. We couldn't afford it. The billionaire took a deep breath. Do you realize what he did last night was extraordinary? The maid hesitated. I know he plays well, but no, the billionaire interrupted gently. He doesn't just play well. He plays like someone born with music in his blood. She paused, then looked at the boy. How did you learn? The boy thought for a moment. My mother works late sometimes, he said softly. When she cleaned the piano after parties, I watched. I listened to how it sounded when the guests played. Sometimes I would remember the sounds and try them on my small keyboard. It's missing keys, but I tried anyway. I just wanted to make it sound right. The billionaire blinked slowly. You taught yourself by listening? He nodded. Mostly, yes. I don't know what notes are called, but I know what they feel like. Something about that answer struck her deeply. What they feel like, she repeated under her breath. Then she smiled slightly. You have a gift. A rare one. The maid stood quietly, unsure how to respond. She had spent so many years serving people like this woman, polishing their silver, ironing their clothes. She had never imagined her son would be the reason they would speak as equals. The billionaire walked to the piano and ran her fingers across the keys. You know, she said softly, I've had this piano for years, but I don't think anyone has ever truly played it until last night. The boy looked at it, his heart fluttering. She turned toward them. Would you play something again? Just for me. The boy glanced at his mother, who gave a small nod. He stepped forward, feeling the cool marble beneath his feet, and sat down. This time there was no laughter, no crowd. Only silence. He touched the keys gently. The sound that came out was soft, almost like a whisper. Then the melody began to grow, slow, steady, like a memory unfolding. It wasn't the same as last night. It was new, calmer, yet filled with feeling. Each note carried a story. His childhood, his mother's tired smile, the sounds of the city, the warmth of small dreams. The billionaire listened without moving. The room seemed to breathe with the music. When he finished, she didn't clap. She simply stood there, staring at the piano as if seeing it for the first time. You have something special, she said finally, and it would be a tragedy to let it fade. The maid's eyes widened slightly. What do you mean, ma'am? The billionaire walked closer to the boy. I want to help him, she said. There's a music academy in the city. The best one. I know the director personally. I can arrange for him to study there. Proper lessons, real teachers, everything he deserves. The maid's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Ma'am, we could never afford that. I didn't say you would pay. The billionaire interrupted gently. This would be my gift to him. A scholarship. The boy's eyes filled with disbelief. You'd really do that? The billionaire smiled faintly. Yes, but you must promise me one thing. Never forget where you came from. Music like yours comes from truth, from pain and love and life. Keep that, never lose it. The maid was speechless. Tears welled up in her eyes and she whispered, I don't know how to thank you. The billionaire shook her head. Don't thank me. Just make sure he keeps playing. For a long while, no one spoke. The boy looked at the piano again, unable to believe what he was hearing. He thought about all the times he had imagined sitting in a real music room, all the times he had stood outside listening to others practice. Now the door was open for him. The billionaire turned to leave but stopped halfway. He'll need a proper instrument to practice on, she said. I'll have one delivered to your home this evening. The maid's knees almost gave out. A piano? She whispered. Yes, the billionaire said. Something smaller but good enough for him to grow with. That afternoon when they left the mansion, the maid's eyes were red but shining. Her son walked beside her in silence, clutching her hand. For the first time in his life, the world felt wide open. At home, he sat quietly, waiting for the piano to arrive. Every sound outside, the passing cars, the footsteps, the wind, felt like part of a song. He couldn't stop smiling. When the movers finally came, they placed a beautiful upright piano near the window. The boy ran his hand across it, feeling the cool, smooth surface. His mother stood behind him, still unable to believe it was real. Play something, she whispered. He sat down carefully, almost afraid to touch it. Then he pressed a single key. The sound filled the room, warm, full, alive. He played again, softly at first, then with more confidence. The notes filled their small home, spilling out through the open window into the street. Neighbors stopped to listen. Children peeked through the doorway. The maid watched her son play, her hands over her heart, her eyes wet again. The music carried something different this time. It wasn't just sadness or longing, it was hope. The billionaire sat by her window in the mansion far away, listening faintly to the sound drifting through the distance. She smiled to herself. For the first time in years, she felt peace. The boy played until the sun went down, until the stars appeared in the sky. He looked out the window, his heart full. He didn't know where this path would lead him, but he knew one thing for sure. Music had changed everything. It had given him a voice, a dream, and a future. And it had reminded everyone who heard him that greatness can come from the quietest corners of the world. The days that followed felt like something out of a dream. Every morning, the small house filled with the sound of music. The boy would wake before the sun rose, sit at the upright piano near the window and let his fingers wander across the keys. At first he played quietly so he wouldn't disturb the neighbors, but soon people began stopping outside just to listen. They didn't mind the early hour. In fact, they waited for it. His music had become something like sunlight, something that warmed hearts even before the day began. His mother watched from the kitchen as she prepared tea, her eyes soft and full of pride. She still couldn't believe any of this was real. The grand piano in the mansion had changed everything. One performance, one song, and now her son's life was moving toward something she never dared to dream for him. The billionaire had kept her word. Within a week, she arranged a meeting with the city's best music academy. The boy had never been to such a place before. Tall glass buildings, echoing halls, students carrying sheet music, pianos in every room. It felt like walking into another world. He sat on a bench in one of the classrooms, waiting nervously as a man in a gray suit walked in, the academy's director. He asked the boy to play something, anything he liked. The boy hesitated at first, then closed his eyes and began to play. The melody that came out was soft and full of wonder. It told a story without a single word. When he finished, the director looked stunned. "He's self-taught?" he asked the billionaire quietly. "Yes," she replied. "He learned by listening." The director shook his head in disbelief. "This is rare. His ear, his timing, his expression, it's all natural. Most students take years to understand what he already feels." The billionaire felt a quiet sense of pride, not for herself, but for what she had witnessed. She had once judged him by his mother's uniform. Now she saw something divine in the simplicity of his gift. By the end of the meeting, the academy had accepted him with full scholarship. The billionaire covered the rest, and with the uniform, the books, even transportation. She said it was her way of giving back something that money alone couldn't buy: opportunity. When the maid heard the news, she couldn't hold back her tears. She hugged her son tightly and whispered, "You did this, not me. You earned it with your heart." He smiled, shy as always. "We both did," he said softly. The first few weeks at the academy were not easy. The boy felt out of place among students who had been playing since they could walk. They talked about composers and scales he'd never heard of. His hands were smaller, his posture less perfect, his clothes simpler. Some students whispered about him, the maid's son who got in by luck. But every time he sat at the piano, everything changed. The others stopped whispering. His music spoke louder than words. Even the teachers found themselves pausing at the door just to listen. He didn't play like someone trying to impress. He played like someone who needed to speak. The billionaire visited occasionally, sitting quietly at the back of the rehearsal room. She never announced herself. She just watched. Each time she saw him play, something inside her softened. It reminded her of the night that started it all, when a boy from nowhere made a room full of proud people fall silent with a single melody. Months passed. The boy grew taller, his fingers more confident. His mother worked the same hours, still cleaning and serving, but now there was light in her eyes that even exhaustion couldn't dim. Every evening when she returned home, she would find him waiting to play her something new. He called them songs for you. Sometimes she would sit beside him, close her eyes, and just listen. It didn't matter how long her day had been. The music erased it all. One evening, as the sun painted the sky orange, a letter arrived from the academy. The boy opened it carefully. Inside was an invitation. He had been chosen to represent the school at a youth music festival. a national event where the best young pianists would perform. He could barely breathe as he read it. His mother gasped and covered her mouth. "You're going to perform again?" He nodded, his eyes wide. "They said it'll be in the city concert hall. With real musicians." She hugged him so tightly he could hardly breathe. "I told you," she whispered. "The world will listen to you one day." The billionaire heard the news too. That evening she sent word that she would be there sitting in the front row. The night of the concert arrived. The grand hall was filled with people dressed in fine clothes, the same kind who once laughed at him. But now no one was laughing. The lights dimmed and the host announced his name. A quiet murmur spread through the audience. Some recognized it from the story that had quietly circulated after that charity night. He walked onto the stage, wearing a simple suit. No jewelry, no shine, just calm eyes and steady steps. He bowed politely and sat down at the grand piano. The hall went silent. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and began to play. This time the music wasn't nervous or uncertain. It was full, powerful, and honest. It told a story of a little boy who had once watched from the shadows, who learned to play by listening to others, who carried the sound of love and struggle in every note. It spoke of his mother, who worked quietly for years without complaint. It even spoke of the woman who once mocked him but later believed in him. Every note carried feeling. The audience leaned forward, breathless. Some wiped their eyes without realizing it. The billionaire sat motionless, her hands clasped tightly, her chest rising and falling with the rhythm. She had heard great pianists before, but this was something else. When the last note faded into the air, silence filled the hall again. The same heavy, powerful silence as that night months ago. Then slowly the applause began. It started with one person, then another, until the entire hall stood up. The boy stood, bowed deeply, and looked toward the front row. His eyes met the billionaire's. She was clapping, tears shining in her eyes. She didn't need to speak. Her expression said everything: gratitude, pride, and a quiet understanding that life had come full circle. After the concert, backstage, the boy's mother hugged him tightly, her voice shaking with emotion. "You did it," she whispered. "You really did it," he smiled softly. "We did it," he said again, just as he had before. The billionaire approached them quietly. She didn't wear her usual cold expression. She looked human. "You made everyone believe tonight," she said. "Not just in music, but in what's possible." The boy looked at her shyly. "Thank you for everything." She shook her head gently. "Don't thank me. You gave me something far more valuable than I gave you. You reminded me that talent doesn't care about walls or money. It just needs someone to listen." The three of them stood there in silence for a moment. A billionaire, a maid, and her son, bound together by something invisible yet powerful: music. In the weeks that followed, the boy's story spread quietly through the city. People spoke about him not as a miracle, but as a reminder that greatness often hides in ordinary places. The billionaire began funding scholarships for underprivileged children who showed artistic talent. She said it was in honor of someone who taught me to see differently. The maid continued her work, but she no longer walked with her head down. Wherever she went, people greeted her with warmth and respect. And at home, the music never stopped. The piano near the window became the heartbeat of their life. Years later, when the boy became a young man, he stood again in the same grand hall where it all began. But this time, he wasn't the poor boy who was asked to play as a joke. He was there as the evening's main performer, a recognized pianist, invited from across the country. As he looked out at the crowd, he saw his mother sitting in the front row, her hands clasped tightly, eyes filled with tears. Beside her sat the billionaire, older now, but still with the same calm presence. He smiled, turned back to the piano, and began to play the same melody that had once silenced a room full of laughter. The music rose again, pure, gentle, and full of heart. And for everyone listening, it was clear that the boy who once had nothing had given the world something money could never buy. The billionaire closed her eyes as she listened. The maid pressed her hands over her heart, and somewhere deep inside, the echoes of that first song still lived, reminding them all that kindness, once given, can change a life forever. And as the last note faded into the quiet air, it was not the sound of an ending. It was the sound of everything beginning again.